get started.
Hello all, thank you so much for joining. I know it's a lot to ask to join another webinar at this point in the still sort of pandemic. So I really appreciate you being on and taking a little time to dive a little deeper into the intersections of stalking and sexual assault today. Of course, in honor of April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, though it's always Stalking Awareness Month and always Sexual Assault Awareness Month to us at Spark. And so always a good time to get into that. For folks on camera, I really appreciate it. It definitely helps me to see human faces, respond to things I say, and know I'm not just talking into the void. So bonus points to you. If you're not camera ready, I respect that. If you are, it's great to see. And look, there's no one expert on stalking or sexual violence or the intersections thereof. We have an amazing group of folks from all across the country doing incredible work on the ground every day. So please don't hesitate to weigh in the chat, to share your experiences, obviously with victim privacy in mind, insights, strategies, etc. So I hope to hear from you all throughout. So today we're talking about stalking and sexual violence, understanding the intersections. My name is Dana Flightman. I'm the Training and Awareness Specialist at Spark, the Stalking Prevention, Awareness, and Resource Center. Spark is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. We are the training and technical assistance provider on stalking. And our website is stalkingawareness.org. On there, you can find practitioner guides, and those are broken out by discipline. So we have for victim services, for campus professionals, for law enforcement, for corrections probation, and for any awareness educators, we have scripted programs that you can pick up and lead to integrate stalking into your existing programming on sexual violence or intimate partner violence. So we have slides and scripts, we have discussion guides on the show You, and other ways to get people talking stalking without you having to reinvent the wheel. We have victim resources. So we are not a direct service provider, but we know victims come to our website for information. So we try to have information to make it easier for you all to help educate those victims. So we have things like these brochures, for example, you can order for free from us, from our website, in English and Spanish. We'll mail them to you so that if you have something to hand your victims of sexual violence, dating violence, hey, you have something for your stalking victims as well. And webinars like this one. So this webinar will be posted on our archives, and we're called Spark, so I got us to call the archives the Sparkives. So that was pretty much the pinnacle of my professional achievement. So you can check us out in the Sparkives after when you want to watch this again and again, as well as for watching other webinars that we have done. I'll do a quick overview on stalking today, but if you're new to kind of stalking content and thinking about stalking, I definitely suggest going through our Sparkives and checking out Context is Key and some of our other foundational webinars. And we're on social media. Our handle on there is at Follow Us Legally. If you get our sick sense of humor at Spark, we are asking you to follow us. We will not be scared. We will not call the police. Please do follow us. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and also sign up for our newsletter. As an anti-stalking organization, we will not contact you excessively or without your consent. So you have to actually opt in to our newsletter, and we only send it about quarterly. It's not something that you're getting, constantly. So anyways, I hope that you will connect with us, and thanks for being here today. So like I said, just as a refresher for folks who have, been on webinars previously, or to bring people in who haven't had the opportunity to do so, just a quick recap of what exactly is stalking. And as I often say at the beginning of my webinars, we always want to remember that there are 4 major crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. But it's always kind of like, and stalking. Like we almost called our website andstalking.org, right? Because so often it's seen as kind of the less scary cousin of these crimes we're primarily focused on, with sexual assault certainly getting a lot of attention and resources relatively, which is great because it's an important issue and it requires those resources. But we don't want to leave stalking out, because the truth is that stalking is prevalent, it is criminal, traumatic, and dangerous. And it often intersects with sexual violence in a variety of ways that we'll discuss today. And so we want to make sure that not only are we asking our sexual assault survivors about stalking, but we're asking our stalking survivors about sexual assault and all of that. You ask everyone about intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and stalking, no matter how the victim is coming to us primarily. So what exactly is stalking? Well, there's your behavioral definition and your state statute or your jurisdictional statute. Every state has a different statute to make it interesting. So some are more broad, some are more narrow. It's important to know your state statute, but I'm going to speak behaviorally today because I'm talking to a national audience and because this tells us what stalking really is and what stalking really looks like. So behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for the person's safety or the safety of others, or to suffer substantial emotional distress. So to break this down just a little bit, it's a pattern of behavior, and that's called a course of conduct in most stalking statutes. So you might hear me use those terms kind of interchangeably today, pattern of behavior, course of conduct. I'm talking about the same thing. Behaviorally, and in most stalking statutes, that's 2 or more incidents. In some of your statutes, 3 or more. So it's a variety of behaviors, and these can be quite varied. Anything that causes fear. So it includes surveillance, which folks often think of, but it's not just surveillance. It's also that excessive contact, following, leaving signs that the person was there, inserting themselves into the person's life, and a variety of other things. So it's a pattern of behavior, 2 or more, directed at a specific person or people. So it's not random. It's not, a peeping Tom looking in the locker room at whoever happened to be there. That might still be a crime, but that's not really stalking, because stalking is directed at specific targets. And it would cause the reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really important to understanding stalking. And when we talk about fear, we talk about the safety or safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. So this is about your bodily safety as well as your emotional safety. And I don't mean emotional safety in a touchy-feely way, like we all feel good all the time, though of course I wish that for you, right? I hope that's where you're at. If you're in emotional distress, you feel that you are under surveillance, that you are being sabotaged, that your life is being invaded. And it's acknowledging that when people have fear, it could be fear of bodily harm, but it could also be fear of losing custody of a child. It could be fear of your reputation being ruined and never being able to, get a job in your field again. So that these other significant fears that someone might have that would cause emotional distress. So like I said, there are so many stalking behaviors. And so we don't have time to go through them all in detail today, but I would like to present this framework or remind folks of this framework because I think it's really helpful. Because when a lot of folks think stalking, they think surveillance, and you get the imagery of like the cameras or the binoculars. And that is a part of a lot of stalking cases, but it's not the only thing, because anything scary that isn't the first thing that's happened could be stalking. And so these categories overlap and intersect, and that's fine, but it's to kind of expand our thinking. So surveillance is pretty much what it sounds like. How might an offender track, watch, monitor, gather information about a victim? Life invasions, how is an offender showing up in the victim's life where the victim doesn't want them to be there? So the victim's trying to get through their day, and there's the stalker or signs of the stalker. And we see that often through showing up, excessive contact, phone calls including hangups, leaving packages, sending gifts, and just that constant, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. Interference is similar, interference through sabotage or attack. So it's what's the victim actually losing or afraid of losing as a result of the stalker's behavior. So that could include a vicious rumor being spread. That could include property damage. They slash my tires, I can't get to work, that interferes with my day. It could include a wide variety of different things that are interfering, including physical and sexual attack, right? That interferes with my bodily safety. I have to deal with the effects of this. And intimidation. Hopefully you can see how all these behaviors are intimidating. But we do see those threats as well, that I will harm you, I'll do this to you. Implicit violence or implicit threats like a crushed can or a threatening gesture. And so all of these, again, can overlap, but there's a whole variety of stalking behaviors. So when we're thinking about stalking, as well as stalking and how it might intersect with sexual violence, all of these behaviors can be done in a way that is sexually violent, essentially, all of these categories. And I'll get into that more in just a second. And stalking is contextual in nature. And that is true for our behaviors that are more sexual in nature as well when it comes to stalking behavior. So for example, if you look at this text message, let's say you get a call from a victim who's hysterical and showing you this. Okay, what's the big deal? I love an emoji, like what's the problem? So in this case, what happened was it was an ex-partner, very abusive. The woman relocated, the victim, address confidentiality, whole thing. And they had previously lived in Florida, kind of in the Everglades. And the offender had always told her if she ever was with another man, he would kill her and feed her to the gators. And so what happens is this victim years later goes on a date and gets this text message from an anonymous number. So when you know the whole story, it's really scary, right? And you can see where it's absolutely a threat. But if we don't know the backstory, it's like, this is a nice text. It has positive words and hearts on it. We don't get it. And so it's really that context that's critical in stalking cases. So something may be scary to the victim, but not to use the responder. And so what you want to do is ask them respectfully, what message did that send to you? Tell me more about that. And I'd argue for some of our sexually violent behaviors, for example, if someone had refused to use, a condom, then they send a package of condoms or something like that, right? There could be other hidden meanings in there that are not immediately apparent. And so ask the victim again, what message did that send to you? Tell me more about that. Because those behaviors often have those specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. And so it's context that makes stalking scary. And it's also context that makes stalking, because it's what else is going on? How are these behaviors adding up that can criminalize otherwise non-criminal behaviors? It's not illegal to text somebody. It is illegal to threaten to kill somebody most places, right? And so it's really the context that makes it. So again, stalking is about fear. And this recent CDC data shows that the vast majority of stalking victims indeed agree. Yes, I felt fearful, threatened, or concerned for safety. But fear of what? Like I said, fear can be a physical violence as well as other kinds of emotional violence. But when we're talking about stalking statutes, most of your stalking statutes include fear of criminal sexual assault at a minimum. Some of them explicitly call out fear of sexual assault. Some it's fear of any sort of sexual violence, regardless of whether it meets a criminal statute. And some it's much more broad and is more like the behavioral definition. And I bring this up because a lot of your statutes explicitly note this connection, that if someone's afraid of sexual assault, that's really stalking. And I think that's important because a lot of times stalking is confused with another crime, which is harassment. And so harassment is typically that repeated behavior that would make someone feel angry, annoyed, frustrated, disrespected, create a hostile environment. And harassment can be quite serious. I'm not trying to minimize it in any way, but it's not necessarily scary. So if someone is making sexual comments, sexual jokes, that might be harassment. But if that victim is truly afraid of sexual violence, I would argue behaviorally that's probably stalking, and under statute it might be stalking as well. So it's worth considering because, for one thing, stalking victims have a higher risk profile than harassment victims. So you want to know what it's stalking, so you safety plan appropriately. And stalking is typically a higher charge than harassment as well. And so if it's stalking, we want to call it that so that we can respond appropriately in all the ways. So in terms of fears that could be sexual in nature, of course, it might include actual sexual assault, but it could also include other common stalking behaviors, including voyeurism or privacy invasion, watching the person when they have an expectation of privacy. Threats to others. I will sexually harm your friend. I got these photos of your sister I'll release, right? Intimate photos being created or shared. So they might have been at one time shared consensually. They might have been shared under a power control dynamic, or they might be fabricated entirely or taken without consent, but having these intimate or sexual photos and spreading rumors and sharing them can be really, really humiliating and scary for a lot of our victims. Or just the offender sharing personal sexual information or rumors, right? So whether it's true or not, saying this person has this kind of, sexually transmitted infection, or this is the kinks that this person has, right? And ruining their reputation. Okay, so first, what do stalking and sexual assault have in common? Well, like I said, they're both crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. They're both criminal, traumatic, and dangerous. And prevalent. So our recent CDC data shows that nearly 1 in 3 women and nearly 1 in 6 men experience stalking victimization in their lifetimes. And this happens to be the exact same estimate as in the previous data that came out a few years prior around contact sexual violence anyways. And so we know that these are underreported, et cetera, but stalking and sexual assault are being experienced at similar rates, right, by our population. And I'd say that we know that victims of all genders are victimized, absolutely. It's not just men and women, but this is the best available national data, and that's how it presents it in the study. So that's why I'm repeating it that way. So a lot of victims are experiencing one or both of these, and these are both victimizations that are like plagued by this myth of the stranger offender. So if you look for pictures of stalking, which I do because I'm fun, okay, this is the kind of stuff you get. So it's a lot of like alleyway strangers, hoodies, binoculars. And it's really very similar to this idea of the stranger rapist that a lot of people grow up thinking about, right? The idea that it's a shadowy stranger in the alley who's going to jump out of the bushes. And that person that most people are thinking of as a stalker or a rapist, while those things can happen, absolutely, there is stranger rape, there is stranger stalking, it's the vast minority of cases. But this is what most people are thinking of when they think of stalking or sexual violence. And it has some real impacts because, again, of course, it's not accurate. The vast majority of stalking and sexual violence cases are perpetrated by someone known to the victim, usually a current or former intimate partner or an acquaintance. And I think for a lot of people that actually makes it scarier because it's often the people that that you might have some level of trust or expectation of trust with. And the research shows that victims rely on what a real crime looks like, and that impacts their reporting decisions. So if you look at like these two figures, which of these looks like the stalker? Which of these looks like the rapist? I'm going to go with Mr. Trenchcoat, right? That is definitely the trope of who is dangerous, but who's actually more likely to be the offender? It would be that person, that current or former intimate partner, that acquaintance, somebody who may not be as obviously threatening, right? And so again, this is a myth that needs to be, and I think people kind of get it because as we talk about sexual assault more, I think more and more people are recognizing that, oh, it's actually the alleyway stranger thing isn't accurate, but that's kind of still where we are with stalking. So it's a similar kind of framework that is keep holding us back a little bit. And victims are afraid when it's someone they know. So this study found that victims who knew their offenders, this is for stalking victims, they're more likely to feel afraid, but less likely to report to police than those stalked by a stranger. And so what that tells us is that victims recognize the risk that this person I know is scary, but it doesn't seem like a crime. And we know that that contributes to underreporting for sexual violence as well, right? Oh, that's not, a rapist. That's my ex. That's my friend. They didn't mean to, giving people the benefit of the doubt. And I can tell you just anecdotally, a stalking victim was telling me she was stalked twice in her life, completely separate incidents. One time by a homeless man in her neighborhood, another by an ex-husband. And guess which one got a stronger and more urgent response, right? It was definitely the homeless man in her neighborhood that, police were on it and she got all this help. But when she was really afraid for her life, it was that ex-partner, right? So that fitting the narrative that is false can be really harmful here for stalking and for sexual violence. And both experience similar kinds of victim blaming. And there's a lot of statements that are made to victims of one or both crimes that really come from the same place of this sense of focusing on the victim and not the offender. So questions like, well, did you lead them on? Or were you really clear you wanted them to stop? Right? We hear that all the time with our stalking victims and our sexual violence victims, the sense of, were your boundaries clear enough? Did you communicate well enough? Were you assertive enough? Instead of focusing on why did the offender continue to violate your boundaries? And so that's so much at the heart of what a lot of victims experience of one or both victimizations. And again, it's underreported, and for some similar reasons. Some of it's that, I know the person, I don't want to get them in trouble. A lot of minimization, that I don't want to make it a whole thing. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe it was a big misunderstanding. And not having faith in law enforcement to respond to it appropriately, as well as just not identifying what happened was a crime. And fear of not being believed. And lack of evidence. We see that with stalking and sexual assault, right? It happened, but I can't prove it, so I'm not going to report it. Okay, so that's what these sort of have in common. How can stalking actually be sexually violent? Well, there's a few different ways. This is big picture, and I'll do a deeper dive into some of these. But the stalker might threaten or plan to assault the victim, right? So some stalkers stalk in order to commit another crime. So they're gathering information, they're figuring out when's this person, who's vulnerable, how vulnerable are they, how can I access them, when are they home, what's their lock code, right? Because they're trying to commit a crime like sexual violence. Their threats and their communication might have a sexual tinge to it, right? They might use sexual language that's degrading, or just be threatening sexual violence. The stalker might try to get someone else to assault the victim. I'll talk about that more in a little bit, but trying to, often through impersonation, getting a third party to approach that victim. The stalker might, of course, actually sexually assault the victim. That might be one crime in their course of conduct. Or sometimes the stalking begins after sexual violence, where there's sexual violence and then there's contact after, either to say, thanks for a great time, or you better not tell anyone, or some conflation of the two to kind of keep an eye on that victim, right? And so that really can become stalking, that intimidating conduct after sexual violence has happened. So again, if we look at our friend, the SLIDE framework here, surveillance, life invasion, interference, intimidation, like I said earlier, all of these different categories have sexually violent behaviors that could be part of a stalking case. So this is not a comprehensive list, but for surveillance, they could be monitoring the victim to figure out when and how to commit sexual violence. They might be gathering information as leverage. Oh, I want to humiliate, exploit, blackmail this person, so let me gather sexual information about them. They might watch the person when nude or engaged in sexual activity and non-consensually, right? So just that watching all the time, just leering, watching what they do, leering, or again, that monitoring after sexual violence. In terms of life invasion, that's showing up all the time, they might leave sexual items or gifts, have repeated contact, including sexual languages, sending images, or referencing past sexual trauma. They might send disturbing images of the victim. They might send, images exposing themselves to the victim as well. They might spread sexual rumors or humiliate the victim with personal information, or impersonate the victim online. All you really need to create a profile on a dating website or a social media site is a photo of the person and an email address. It's really quite easy to do. So we see a lot of impersonation of victims on sites they would not normally be on, or just with information that's not accurate, that's then promoting some kind of sexual violence. In terms of interference, it could be actual sexual violence, of course, that's interfering, sharing sexual photos or information, again, that impersonation, or damaging or taking sexual items like poking holes in condoms, stealing someone's birth control, other things that interfere with somebody's sexual autonomy. And intimidation, of course, those threats of sexual violence, symbolic sexual violence. And we see this quite a bit. So maybe the offender breaks in the home and cuts underwear in certain areas, or ejaculates on the victim's bed, or other things that are disturbing and sexual in nature. Or again, those threats to share that sexual information. Okay, so to break these down a little bit more with a few examples, again, a stalker might be stalking in order to commit sexual violence. And so we're going to watch, this is a short news clip that I think captures that really well.
This hour, and new details on that attempted kidnapping at a Catoosa Walmart. Suspect Travis Wilson remains in the Rogers County Jail without bond after being arraigned on charges this morning.
Channel 8's Amy Jensen met with police today who are digging deeper into Wilson's history with the woman. Amy?
Neely, this truly is a scary situation. Police told me that Travis Wilson admitted to stalking this woman every day for 2 months. He said that he knew her schedule down to the minute, but fortunately this woman did all of the right things to help put him behind bars. For 2 months, a scared woman hid in her friend's basement. Police say she was afraid of this man, Travis Reed Wilson.
He'd been stalking and harassing her for several months. It's a jealousy issue.
Officer Brent Colbert told me Wilson confessed to attempting to kidnap his ex-girlfriend from this Walmart Thursday night.
We believed, that he was going to take her back to his residence in Tulsa. To do what, we're not for sure, but it wasn't good.
Officers say Wilson broke into the woman's car and waited for her to come out of the store. With him, he had makeshift handcuffs, gasoline, rope, and tape. To add to the terror, this isn't the first time he's had a run-in with police. And officers don't think this was the first time he's attempted to hurt this woman. This protective order, filed just 4 days ago, recounts some of the terror this woman has gone through over the last several months, including allegations that Wilson cut a hole in her roof and hid in her attic. And Tulsa police tell me they are investigating at least 2 other cases that involve him.
They're trying to get it done as quickly as possible so that they can get this individual picked up. It's just not an immediate thing.
All right, so this, I want to say too, this clip's just capturing one news report in one moment in time. So we don't know the whole story, exactly what happened after the investigation, et cetera, but just kind of taking this as a standalone educational tool. One, I think you can really see that stalking to commit another kind of violence, very likely sexual violence in this case, right? That he knew her schedule down to the minute. He knew when she'd go to the store, he knew where she'd park, he knew how long she'd take. And luckily in this case, there was a bystander who saw him get the offender get in the vehicle and called police, and they got there in time. And so, we see that watching someone in order to access them to commit sexual violence. But I also want to point out that, we have this officer saying, look, we're trying to get him picked up, but it's not an immediate thing. And at this point, this is news, right? This is news. But this woman was hiding in her friend's basement for 2 months. So what was going on there? I guarantee it was some of the other stalking behaviors that I've already mentioned, that texting, sending packages, showing up, following in the car. But those are often not responded to with the urgency that they really require until there's something like this violence or attempted violence, sexual violence, attempted sexual violence, right? And at that point, folks look backwards and say, oh, there's this whole history of stalking victimization. How different it could be if we would identify the stalking while it's happening and intervene then to prevent that trauma and violence that might be coming. And so there we have an offender watching someone in order to commit sexual violence. This woman was already afraid of him. But we also have offenders use stalking strategies to groom for sexual violence. So if you think about grooming in the context of stalking, this is, and there are multiple types of sexually violent offenders. I'm not saying this is what every sexual violent offender does, but there are those repeat perpetrators that have a very specific MO. And this is what it is. They're going to research and identify vulnerable victims. So that could be an upperclassman looking at freshman women and saying, who doesn't have a lot of drinking experience, who seems kind of naive. That could be an adult looking for children and saying, who's, from a marginalized community, who seems kind of neglected. Then they're going to establish relationships and build trust through multiple contacts. That could either be, hey, you seem really mature for a freshman, or I understand you so much better than your parents. Okay, they're going to have multiple contacts. If they haven't yet, they're going to meet in person. Usually they'll initiate that and isolate the victim. On a campus, that might be inviting the victim to a party, plying them with alcohol, and then taking them to a separate space to commit the assault and coerce them into their sexual acts at that point. For that child, it might be, hey, come, let's see what's in the basement, take some pictures, coerce them into sexual acts, and then contact them after. either to say you better keep quiet, or that was so much fun, or I got pictures, don't tell anyone, or, and again, some combination of those. And we know that they might also do other things like drive by the home to make sure that the victim knows, hey, don't tell anyone, I'm watching you, right? But it's really building this kind of trust through multiple contacts in order to commit the sexual violence and then contacting after. So I encourage you to think about, okay, think about this through the lens of stalking. Is it a pattern of behavior? Yes, it's 2 or more things, absolutely. Is it directed at a specific person? Absolutely. They are targeting specific victims based on their perceived vulnerabilities. And would it cause a reasonable person to feel fear? Well, yeah, most of us are afraid of sexual violence. And you might be thinking, but when though? Because, you know, that, for example, freshman woman might say, well, I wasn't scared day 1. I was flattered, right? But there's no statute that says when fear has to attach. So if a victim's looking back and saying, you know, I wasn't scared on day 1, but now that I look back and realize our entire relationship was a setup for my sexual assault, and that all started with, you know, that text message or that time they waited for me outside of class, and that's terrifying, I would argue behaviorally, that's still stalking. And so I encourage you to think about, if you're looking at grooming, think about stalking as well in terms of your safety planning and the information and access an offender might have, as well as potentially for your charging decisions, because, you know, a lot of sexual violence cases come down to a moment of consent or non-consent, but there might be more evidence of this continued contact and grooming behavior. And so maybe there could be some accountability for stalking there. I'm not saying that always works every single time, but it's something to consider in terms of having some kind of accountability. This is another case where an offender found women through his work, and then tried to target them for sexual violence. So we're going to give that a watch.
Prosecutors say he was a copy machine repairman in East Bay offices and targeted the women.
Matt Caruso appeared before a judge in Martinez this morning. He pleaded not guilty to 3 charges, including attempted kidnapping and assault with intent to commit rape.
There are multiple victims involved. The investigation's still ongoing. Right now, we've charged 1 for Jane Doe 1, but we could always add additional criminal charges.
On March 26, Caruso is accused of attacking Jane Doe 1 outside her Walnut Creek apartment building as she left for work. Prosecutors say he pointed a stun gun at her hip, but the taser malfunctioned. As the woman dropped her bags, the DA's office says he tripped over her bags and fell into the bushes as she ran away. He dropped his cell phone as he escaped. That cell phone prompted investigators to zero in on Caruso, along with a bag retrieved from a dumpster.
A rape and kidnapping kit, which included ties and bondage.
Caruso was arrested at his home in Newark the next day. Walnut Creek police are leading the investigation.
Could there be?
All right, so in this case, and I show it because I think we can tend to focus on intimate partner cases, and I'm guilty of that as well. That's where a lot of our stalking research comes from. But it's not only our intimate partner stalkers who are engaging in sexual violence. We have offenders like this person who's, you know, a copy machine repairman who goes from building to building. Throughout his professional contact, he's finding women and figuring out their contact information and who they are, and then showing up at their homes with the intent to commit sexual violence. Right. And we see, unfortunately, offenders using dating websites this way and other, other avenues, meeting people and choosing targets based on whatever their network might be and engaging in that stalking behavior to find them. So intimate image solicitation and exploitation, I've already touched on a little bit, but it's so common. And I don't think folks often think about it as a stalking behavior, but again, that fear that an image will be released or taken is very real and very emotionally distressing. And this is also known as revenge porn. We don't like to call it that because it's not really about revenge, it's not really porn, but I know that intimate image solicitation and exploitation is a little hard to say, so I understand why people call it revenge porn, but that's kind of the category that we're talking about here. So sometimes that might be for leverage, right? They're going to attain a photo or recording without the victim's consent, or that's gather information for that later sextortion. You better do this or else I will release these. So for example, this was a stalker who used the persona of a minor league baseball player to lure teenage girls and young women into giving him their phone numbers. So what he did was he made multiple profiles online, pretending to be this other person, you know, flirting with them, being really likable, gets their phone numbers, and then begins threatening these victims with sexual violence if they don't send degrading sexual images. And then, of course, if they do that, he says, okay, he's going to post the photographs if they don't meet him for sex in person. And so that anonymity, that's a hard word to say, online, and that impersonation of, sometimes it's of the victim and sometimes it's of a third party who the victim might find attractive, and then revealing themselves, but it's too late, right? So that getting that non-consensual image that way through stalking. And again, it's stalking, that repeated contact, that scary, that threat. And a lot of our victims are experiencing this. You know, at least 16% of victims 18 to 24 years old are saying that their stalker, these are stalking victims, that their stalker shared nude, semi-nude, and or sexually explicit photos or videos of them. So this is a kind of coercion and fear that many stalkers are using. There's a few resources for non-consensual image distribution, so I encourage you to check those out. And also just again, conceptually, if you're working on a case or working with a victim of this, to think about, is this an isolated incident? Is this one time that an image is being released? Or is this part of a bigger course of conduct? Is this same offender who's threatening or actually releasing this, you know, recording, also contacting the victim, texting them, showing up, sending gifts? Because if so, that's also a stalking case, and it often gets missed because we tend to be quite incident based. So with any of these, kind of taking a step back and thinking, what else is going on here, both sexually explicit and not. Now, I've already mentioned this in passing, but I think an example is the most helpful way to kind of explain this. So the soliciting of third-party sexual violence. So for example, this is a pretty well-known case. It was a former Marine who just went on Craigslist. And if you're familiar with Craigslist, you don't really verify your identity in any way. And so he pretended to be his ex-girlfriend and said, you know, I have a violent rape fantasy. This is what I'm into. Here's where I live. Here's what I look like. If I yell and scream, that's all part of it. You know, come find me. So unfortunately, an offender did respond to that ad and assault that woman. The only good news is that both offenders were held accountable. So I think when most people look at this, they're not like, oh, a stalking case. But again, this man's posting multiple ads that would cause a reasonable person fear, right? And sending third parties there. This is a little bit more of a recent case in which an offender used a dating website. So we're going to watch this quick clip that explains what happened.
Matthew Herrick says for months he couldn't go to the restaurant where he waited tables or his home without men he didn't know approaching him for sex or drugs. Attorneys Carrie Goldberg and Tor Eklund are representing the Manhattan resident in a lawsuit against Grindr, the gay dating app.
This was a life or death matter. They would follow him into the bathroom at work. They wouldn't take no for an answer.
Herrick says his ex created impersonating profiles of him and arranged sex dates with more than 1,400 men. The actor didn't want to speak publicly today,
but I don't have any comment right now.
Right. So yeah, in this case, he's impersonating the ex and then having these conversations, pretending to be the victim, and then sending strangers to approach the victim. And because he's engaging in surveillance as well. And so, you know, he's watching the victim all the time. And so he'll send a message, hey, I'm in this coffee shop. I'm in a red sweater. Come find me for what we talked about. This poor victim's being approached by random people. You know, and I don't know what we're talking about. And so I wish I could tell you these are these really extreme off the wall cases, but the reality is we're seeing them more and more. And I encourage you to, of course, address them however you can in your jurisdiction, but also to consider that when we have multiple things going on here, that we're also really looking at stalking victimization. You mentioned earlier, there can also be stalking after sexual violence. And so you might end up seeing something like this. And of course, we know our stalker's tone can change again quite a bit, right? So it might be that, hey, thanks for a great time, our secret. It gets a little bit more threatening, and then, hey, answer me. And so these repeated unwanted contacts, right? That is really evidence of not only the sexual violence that took place, but also its stalking behavior, right? It's that stalking. We also see offenders, again, impersonating other people. So in this case, an offender impersonated a mutual friend of the victim, and the offender had committed the sexual assault, and then impersonating the mutual friend contacted the victim and really encouraged her. So this was through online, through like instant message and things, direct messaging, and really encouraged the victim to open up and to heal and to share her story and all of this. And then the victim realized the person she'd been talking to was the offender. And so here's a quote with this: "Finding out the person who sexually assaulted me was the one receiving my texts made my road to recovery even longer," right? And you can imagine the additional trauma and lack of trust that could create. And when we think about contact after or before, think broadly about contact. It could be in person, through third parties, phone, texting, email, IM chat, and also posting to one's own page, right? So if someone's posting on their own social media, hey, people better keep their mouths shut, and the victim feels it's about them, why do they feel that way? Was it directed at the victim? Can we make that link? Because there's a lot of potentially sexually violent behaviors, there's also a lot of potential charges that could happen if your victim's going that route. So we always say, if you can't charge stalking, charge something, right? And so, all of you have different statutes, but that might be voyeurism, unlawful creation of image of another, non-consensual distribution, indecent exposure, sexual assault. And you're building the course of conduct, right? Because stalking is about 2 or more behaviors. And so if on day 1 you have indecent exposure, on day 2 you have voyeurism, I know I'm not your judge, but according to me, Judge Dana, you have a stalking case now too. You have 2 or more behaviors that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. But if we didn't really do anything with that indecent exposure, we didn't document it, save the evidence, report it, etc., now we don't have a stalking case because we're starting from 2 and you're starting from 1 instead of 2. Right. And so even if it seems minor, look at your statute, look at computer crimes. This is not only for sexually violent offenses, though, of course, that's what we're focusing on today. And think about how that accountability might work, as well as even if they're not going that route, just saving the evidence and documenting everything. So I already mentioned that these victimizations intersect. And I think that this is, I buried it, but it's kind of the headline here, is how much co-victimization is going on that's so often missed. And so just right off the bat, this was a large survey of sexual assault survivors ages 18 to 24. And it simply asked them, have you experienced stalking in the same period of time? And nearly half are saying yes. And so it's not all of them, but nearly half of them are saying, yes, I've experienced both sexual violence, or in this case, actual sexual assault and stalking. And for both of these crimes, the offender is often a current or former intimate partner. That's true in about 40% of stalking cases, over 1 in 3 sexual assault cases. And so that co-victimization there is kind of inherent in terms of its intimate partner violence, it's stalking, it's sexual assault, right? Where it's often these offenders doing a variety of behaviors. So if we look at our friend, the power and control wheel, which my guess is you've seen before, this highlights all the different ways that somebody can exert power to control another person, that in addition to physical and sexual violence. And so I bring this up because a lot of times, if I do hear stalking mentioned when we're talking about intimate partner violence, people talk about it like this. They'll say like, okay, it was an abusive relationship, the victim left, and from the day the victim left, that abuser began stalking them. And that can happen, absolutely. But let's take a step back. If during the relationship, that abuser is contacting constantly, taking photos non-consensually and sharing them, following them around, showing up, asking friends and family where they are, that's stalking, right? It's intimate partner violence. It's what we might call emotional abuse or digital abuse, and it's stalking. And it can happen before, during, and or after a relationship. Over half the time, it's happening during the relationship as well. And we want to know that. We want to know when there's stalking happening during an intimate partner violence relationship, because on average, our intimate partner stalkers are our most dangerous stalkers and are most likely to be sexually violent. And so Women who were stalked by partners experienced a variety of victimizations, including sexual abuse, at significantly higher rates than women who were not stalked by their partners. And so this is a study that dives into this a little bit more. And so it's looking at these different kinds of sexual victimization. So when women, these are all women with protective orders. Some of them have, so they've all been abused. Some of them were abused and stalked. For the women abused only, they still have these significant rates you're seeing here of, almost half experiencing sexual degradation, more than 1 in 10 experiencing penetration while sleeping, certainly a decent amount of victimization. Let's add stalking to it. So now women who have been abused and stalked, look how much higher these numbers are almost across the board, where sexual degradation goes from 45 to over 60%. Sexual coercion goes from a little under half to over 3/4. Verbal pressure doubles, substance abuse quadruples, implicit threats and force. Now we're looking at almost half of our victims, and penetration also increases. And so again, when there's abuse and stalking, there is more likely to be multiple forms of sexual violence, right? Now, if there's abuse, stalking, and rape, there's penetrative rape at one point. Now we're looking at the highest rates of all, right? So, and they're more likely to be experiencing a whole variety of these other sexually violent behaviors. But again, we want to know when there's stalking and abuse, because if not, we're here, and with the stalking, we're here. And I'm not saying that stalking causes these other kinds of victimization. I'm just saying it's an indicator that when you see stalking in an intimate partner violence relationship, whether it's during or after, that should be a big red flag that, hey, this victim is likely experiencing other forms of sexual violence. If we don't call it stalking, we miss that. We miss that indicator. About 1 in 3 women stalked by an intimate partner were also sexually assaulted by that partner. So again, it's these behaviors that often go together. And women stalked by a violent partner after obtaining a protective order were 9.3 times more likely to experience sexual assault than the women who were not stalked. And so when and I know I have folks here sitting in different agencies, but the truth is there's few, if any, standalone stalking agencies, right? Most victims come in either through domestic violence services, sexual assault or rape crisis, or on a campus like Title IX. But I would argue a lot of people associate the Title IX office with sexual assault because that's the way that a lot of folks talk about it. And our rape crisis centers as well might be the best place for a stalking victim to go, but it's not necessarily intuitive. So I encourage you to think about, if you're dealing with, not dealing with it a bad way, but if you're talking to a victim who is primarily presenting as a victim of sexual violence, make sure you ask them about stalking victimization and intimate partner violence victimization, because they may or may not think to disclose that to you. If they're focused on the incident of sexual violence, they may or may not think it's relevant that, oh yeah, they keep texting me and I keep getting these weird gifts and they've been following me around and my friends said they ran into them, right? They may not think that's relevant because we're talking about, the night of the incident. But the truth is it wasn't just the incident, it's this ongoing course of conduct that you want to know about because they're at higher risk for other victimizations and because you want to safety plan appropriately. And so a lot of us, our lenses can be a little bit focused in, right, on I'm a rape crisis provider, I'm looking for sexual violence, I'm domestic violence, and we need to expand and think about all of it, and also recognize that, again, there are few, if any, standalone stalking service providers. And so it falls to folks that are primarily focused on domestic or sexual violence to add stalking on and to pick that victimization out. I'm not saying this is fair because those are already both big crimes with a lot of victims and a lot of work to do. But I'm saying that's the reality of the situation. And it can be quite confusing for victims as well, because if I'm being stalked by, say, a neighbor and there was no sexual relationship, why would I call rape crisis? But that might be where the victim advocate is that can actually give me the best services, right? So I encourage you to think about integrating stalking into your response to sexual violence, as well as if you're primarily focused on sexual violence response, how can you add stalking victims into that? And how can you better serve them? So I know I keep saying like, name stalking, you have to call it stalking. And you might be like, okay, you're the stalking lady. I get you care that I call it stalking. But why do I care? And it's for these reasons, some of which I've already mentioned. One is charging and prosecution options, right? Most prosecutors like having a menu of charges. So if we can put stalking in there, great. Obviously, it's not always appropriate, but when it's appropriate, let's do that. There might be more evidence than for that incident of sexual violence. And it's also a really powerful and charge, and prosecutors love it when they get it. And I'll tell you why. Because if you're charging, say, an incident of domestic violence or sexual violence, the court's going to try to limit you to that 10 minutes of, alleged violence. But if you're charging stalking, you can bring in the entire course of conduct and paint a much fuller picture of just how terrible this offender is. So now they know that not only did this offender, were they sexually violent, but now they're sending creepy pictures. Now they're exposing themselves to the person. Now they're engaging in voyeurism. Oh, wow, what a terrible person. All that can come in because we're talking about stalking the whole course of conduct, right? So it can be really, really strategic that way beyond an isolated incident. And also, like I said earlier, there might be different kinds of evidence for stalking versus sexual violence because stalking is about those repeat contacts. And so maybe we can have accountability for something there. Also, safety planning. Stalking is its own form of victimization. When you identify stalking, it should be a big red flag that this person's at higher risk for not only the sexually violent victimizations that I talked about today, but as well as bigger picture, domestic violence and intimate partner homicide, right? Stalking is urgent, but it is often left out of the conversation. And so if we just call it emotional or digital abuse, we miss the fact that these victims are at elevated risk, and that we also miss the chance to say, oh, stalking, okay, let me think about surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, interference. Let me think about the access and information that the offender might have to this victim, and let me really safety plan specifically for stalking in addition to that sexual violence. And victim empowerment. Even if a victim's like, I'm not going to do any of that. Like, I don't want to charge it. I'm not going to go to police. I don't want to change anything or really make much of a plan. Even just to be able to name what they're experiencing besides, yeah, they were disrespectful to me and now they keep texting me. To be able to say, I'm being stalked, and that's a real thing, and that's a victimization, and I can Google it, and it's a crime, and something will come up. Even just to be able to articulate that can go a really long way for our victims and survivors. So a few big picture tips on responding to victims. One, and again, I know folks here are sitting in different agencies with different roles, but do you ask sexual assault victims about stalking victimization? Is that a routine part of your intake or screening process? If you're primarily a sexual assault crisis agency, but you also serve victims of stalking, how do you reach those stalking victims? How do they know that you have services for them? Is the word stalking on your website? Do you share examples of intimate and non-intimate partner stalking, et cetera? So we have a checklist of fun questions like that you can ask at your next staff meeting to be the most popular one there, with questions about incorporating stalking into that response. But even small things like, if you have your brochure on sexual assault, do you have one on stalking, right? Is it just something that's named and is part and integrated into your response and outreach to victims? And what services are available? For example, in domestic violence shelters, sometimes it's not clear if I'm a victim of stalking that's not intimate partner, can I come into shelter? Or is that only for intimate partner violence victims? Because again, there's not the stalking shelter. That's not a thing. So, it's kind of added on to these other services. Now, it's important to realize that victims cope with stalking several different ways. All of these are valid human responses, but some might be more or less helpful for responding to the stalker. So some victims might move against the stalker. So, oh, you're stalking me? Cool, I'm bringing you to jail, right? That is all I'm gonna do. I'm writing it all down. I'm gonna call everything in. Like, they're very determined to move against the stalker and take them down. You have others do the opposite, move inward. I don't want to cause a problem. I don't want to make it a whole thing. I don't want to inconvenience anyone. And so they might become very isolated and just quiet about it. You have others move away. That's why so many stalking victims literally relocate. 1 in 7 stalking victims move to get away from their offenders. But you also have move away in ways such as, okay, I blocked them on Facebook. I stopped using social media. I switched my routes to and from school, kind of creating distance. You have others do the opposite, move towards the offender to kind of appease them. Okay, they want to talk every day, I'll call them once a week. Maybe that will be enough. And you have some move outward, move to folks like you who can help, and that's great. But by the time they've done that, they've probably already tried some of these other things. And so it's helpful to ask what they've done or not done, and what's worked and not worked, so you can meet them where they are. Also, again, while all of these are very valid human responses, some may be more or less helpful. And one that I want to address is this moving away piece. So one piece of advice often given to stalking victims is to move away in a variety of ways. So it might be, oh, you're on social media, stop being on social media, or block them, or they keep calling you, change your phone number, right? But let's play that out for a second. If I'm stalking you and you're like, I'm maybe my favorite thing to do is call you. I'm always calling you on the phone. And eventually you're like, I'm so over Dana stalking me, I'm gonna change my freaking number. So eventually I call and get that this number is no longer in service. Am I the stalker gonna be like, oh man, I guess I'll stop stalking you and become a productive member of society this day? Like, no, what am I gonna do? I'm already stalking you. I know where you work, I know where you live, I know your email. I'm just gonna get to you another way. And I might actually escalate my behavior because how dare you? That was my favorite way to stalk you. You think you can get away from me? Right? And so I'm not saying victims should never do this. I'm just saying it's not this obvious low-hanging fruit it's sometimes presented as. Now, from a criminal justice perspective, it's really helpful because it shows that resistance and persistence, right? It shows, okay, they blocked the number, they called from a new number, they moved, they found the new address, right? It shows, hey, they definitely know that they're being scary and they keep doing it. So that's really great for an evidence. But did it make the victim safer? Maybe, maybe not. One piece of move away advice that is generally advisable is to cease contact with the offender. And that's because most offenders see any contact as a win. So if you call, they call 100 times and the victim picks up and says, I hate you, don't call me again. Tomorrow they're calling 101 times because that was a win for that offender. That being said, that disengagement is not always possible or realistic. And we do see victims move towards the offender to kind of appease them. So for example, there was a case, this woman, it was actually being prosecuted, and it came out in trial that this woman had called the offender at 2 a.m. and they talked for hours. And so of course the defense is like, how scared can she be? If she's so scared, why would she call him, right? So we asked the victim, and the victim was like, yeah, I called him because I knew he got off work at the bar at 2 a.m. I could hear him get in his car, drive home and fall asleep. I knew he wouldn't come over, break my windows, wake my kids up again. Right? Perfectly reasonable. So sometimes it's more that keep your enemies closer and take the temperature of the situation that victims are doing in the best interest of their safety. So it's really both, right? You want to recommend no contact and recognize victims engage in behaviors to keep themselves safe. If there are hard and fast rules in your jurisdiction, like if they reach out to an offender, the protective order's dropped, make sure they know that. On campuses, no contact orders are mutual. So it's good to know that. But it's not like they did something wrong, right? You want to have an open dialogue with them so you can continue to safety plan around it and be strategic and recognize that they're doing the best they can in negotiating their safety, right? If you look at the bottom of the screen, some victims are getting this all day, every day. You can imagine the temptation to respond and say, stop it, I hate you, is strong. It doesn't mean the person's not really afraid or that it's not really stalking, right? Of course, working with stalking victims, same as with our sexual assault victims, we want to think about safety. And I would just say with sexual assault that is incident-based, as in there was a sexual assault and now the victim is working to heal from that, those services might look different than someone who and they're still being stalked, right? Which is why it's good to know that, how can I continue to keep this person safe from the continuing trauma from these constant reminders from the offender. So thinking about safety, advocating for that victim, documenting everything, and connecting to support services. And those can be quite varied. That might be mental health, it might be housing, be a different variety of things. We often tell victims to document, but we don't always tell them how. And so we're often, they might be like, it was a sunny spring day in Washington. And we're like, oh no, this isn't what we wanted, right? So something like this can be very helpful. when you've identified that stalking is going on or might be going on. So this is free on our website. You can download it and, you know, adapt it how you will, but very succinct: date, time, what happened, where did it happen. A lot of jurisdictional issues in stalking cases, and most victims don't understand jurisdiction. So they feel like, I called the police, and may not recognize, oh, but that's over the county line, or that's over the state line. It's a totally different statute, right? As well as if technology was used, which often technology is used or misused to stalk, both in a sexual way or otherwise, right? And so if it was, you know, a upsetting image sent through Snapchat, getting that evidence is different than if it was sent through email. It's different than if it was a text message. And so knowing which platform can be really helpful. It can also help figure out the scope of the offender's stalking behavior. If they've hacked into different accounts, are they in all of them? Or are they in some of them, right? So it's just a helpful thing to know, but also, again, for those evidentiary reasons. If there were witnesses, their information, if evidence is attached. And look, when most victims get, say, a threatening text message, understandably, they want to delete it, right? They get a creepy package at the door. They might want to throw it out right away. They don't want to touch it. Very human impulse. But of course, you know, encourage your victims to save that evidence, document it, take pictures, take screenshots, so that they can, one, for their own peace of mind, so later they're not like, did I make that up? No, it happened. There's the picture, right? And as well as, of course, for if they are pursuing any sort of criminal justice avenue, to make sure that the evidence is there. Just quickly on screenshots, what you want to do is slide your thumb over to show the date and time, text 1, 2, 3, take a picture, slide down, 3, 4, 5, take a picture. You need 3 twice to show that nothing happened between 3 and 4 that changes the context, right? So make sure that you do that. And there's more guidance I can give you on collecting digital evidence, not always intuitive at all. And so those things can be helpful to know. And if they made a report, you know, to who did they make it? And so that might be law enforcement, but also if it's, oh no, this time I just called, you know, my front desk security. And this time I told my RA, and this time I told, you know what, if they reported it to anyone, let's just write that down there and help connect the dots. Because the truth is these incidents add up, but they only add up if we do the math, right? And something like this can be really helpful in doing that. And certainly if you think, not limited to, but including if there's stalking after sexual violence, this can be really helpful to say, well, here's the sexual violence, and then here's all these other contacts I've gotten after, right? That's gonna really help you build a stalking case. Of course, what we need most of all is a lot easier said than done, which is that coordination, right? We need, because our system's set up to be incident-based. You know, there's an incident, whether it's sexually violent or not, you know, there's a crime, and we respond to that crime. And stalking's not like that. You know, it's a pattern of behavior, it's contextual in nature, it's sometimes multi-year, multi-jurisdictional. The average duration of a stalking case, not the high end, the average is 2 years, and 10% of cases last 5 years or more. So a stalking case can last from an afternoon to a lifetime. It can include contact sexual violence, it can include sexual threats, it can include so many different things or not, right? And so we really, and usually in these cases where something goes really wrong, it's not like one person made a mistake. It's not like, oh yeah, if that one officer had called that in, this case would have been fine. It's usually a system problem. And different people know different information and no one's connecting the dots. And we really need everyone working together on this, right? We need our awareness educators to make sure that stalking victims know what's going on, that they identify what's happening, that if they've experienced sexual violence or their friend has and they tell that friend, they help get them help, and also identify that stalking victimization as well. Wow, that sounds terrible. And this person keeps contacting you, or they're making what kind of threat? Okay, that's illegal, dude. Like, let's get you some help, right? That they identify what's happening. As well as combating those myths I talked about earlier, that no, it could still be a stalker, even if it's an intimate partner, just like it can still be a rapist if it's an intimate partner, right? So kind of changing our national conversation on that, which I think our national discourse has changed or increased quite a bit on sexual violence, to a lesser degree, maybe intimate partner violence, and to a way lesser degree stalking. So we need to get stalking in there as something that so often intersects and co-occurs. So, you know, awareness educators doing that, We need our victim service providers to identify stalking victimization, to safety plan around it appropriately and urgently. We need our law enforcement to charge stalking because it's very undercharged to see what's going on. We need our prosecutors to pick up those charges and argue them effectively. We need our courts to sentence appropriately, recognizing the danger that these stalking offenders pose and set appropriate bail and bond. And we need our probation, parole, and corrections folks to continue to hold these offenders accountable and keep our victims safe. And also recognize that if they're supervising, say, a sexually violent offender, they might also be supervising a stalking offender, even if they're not in for stalking, right? And recognize all those different behaviors. When any of that doesn't happen, we lose victims. And the truth is there's no one's job to make sure this happens. And after this little over an hour, you now know more about stalking than most people in our field. That's the reality of the situation. And so it kind of has to be you in whatever role you play, recognizing that if you identify, hey, this is a stalking victim, not everyone's going to get why this is urgent or what this could mean, but I do. And being that advocate for the person, however you can, and helping them walk through our system. Couple of resources to help you do so. We have some information on some of the content I covered today that you can share a little easier than this webinar, though again, this webinar will be posted. So we have an infographic on stalking and sexual violence. We have those different sexually violent behaviors in a handout, as well as a fact sheet on some of those intersections. So I hope as you continue to observe Sexual Assault Awareness Month, you bring stalking into that conversation, and we tried to make it easy for you to do so. We're a project of Equitas, the prosecutor's resource for violence against women. So they can help with the prosecution of sexual violence and or stalking, free 24/7 technical assistance, really great resource. There's no national stalking hotline. The closest thing we have is Victim Connect, run out of the National Center for Victims of Crime. So if you're ever sharing like the RAIN hotline, the DV hotline, make sure you share Victim Connect as well. Now, again, they're likely going to refer to rape crisis or domestic violence service agencies, even if the stalking is not related to those crimes. And of course, everyone's favorite website, you know it, you love it, stalkingawareness.org. We've got practitioner guides, again, broken out by discipline, training tools for awareness educators that you can just pick up and use right away, as well as, the infographics, et cetera, that we just named. Again, if you're doing sexual assault education on your campus or in your community, you should be, not to tell you what to do, but you should be talking about stalking too, right? And so we have some guidance on incorporating stalking into your existing programming, as well as doing standalone programming. Victim resources like the brochures and other information, and webinars like this one. And I hope you'll keep in touch with us, follow us on social, and sign up for our newsletter. This is my contact information. I just want to thank you so much for your attention and for joining today. I know that there's a lot of activity during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which is a great thing. There's a lot of webinars and content to choose from. And I know it's easy for me to sit here and say, hey, do this, think about this, serve this kind of victim, consider these intersections. But you're the ones who are really on the ground, keeping victims safe and holding offenders accountable. It is all easier said than done, and I totally understand that. So thank you so much for the work that you do and for all of your attention today. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. I saw a couple come in, so I'll go back through, but please continue to ask. And thanks so much for joining me. Let's see. The first question I saw was this: are there any guides related to meaning, significance, and placement regarding objects? Many are obvious, but context varies with age and location. I assume you mean in terms of that, like sending sexual objects or destroying someone's underwear or things like that. There's no specific guide to that because, like you said, it is so contextual in nature, but it's the context with age and location, but just also individual to individual. Like, let's say an offender sexually assaults someone using a specific object, and then they keep sending them that object. There's, regardless of the age or location, it's about that very specific case and that very specific threat to that victim that they are getting because of that history of sexual violence. And so I think that we don't have like a guide about it, but it's just explaining that more. Why is this scary? What message does this send to the victim? Why are they in fear, right? What's the history here? What's the backstory? Someone asked, which stalker is most likely to sexually assault victims? As far as we know, those are our intimate partner stalkers. On average, are our most dangerous offenders. Now, all stalkers can be dangerous, and all stalkers can commit sexual violence. So I'm certainly not ruling that out in any way, shape, or form. But on average, our intimate partner stalkers are, again, the most dangerous. So they're the most likely to threaten, approach in person, use weapons to threaten or harm. The recidivism rate's the highest, and they're likely to commit sexual violence as well. Someone asked for slides. Can I send slides? I have a PDF of them, so I should be able to get those to you. Someone asked, is there a risk assessment used for sexual violence and stalking? So there is a risk assessment specific to stalking. That's great, and we love so much. It's at, I'm just going to put it in the chat here, coercivecontrol.org. It's called the Stalking and Harassment Assessment and Risk Profile. It does include some questions about sexual violence victimization, but it's primarily looking at stalking. And so it's really great because most other risk assessments might mention the stalking behavior or two, but they're not focused that way. So it's free, it's online, it's really wonderful. And there's a webinar in our archives of us going through the risk assessment with a sample case if you want to look at it before you're sitting across from a victim. So there's no assessment I'm aware of that's like, we're looking at both of these victimizations very explicitly, but I can tell you that in the SHARP assessment that I'm referencing, they do ask about sexual violence victimization, and historically as well as ongoing in the course of conduct. Let's see. Just looking through. Is social media taking steps preventing stalking or at least minimizing the risk of stalking? I guess I'm not quite sure I understand your question. Are you saying in terms of are the platforms taking steps or, yeah, depends on the platform. And so, you know, in terms of what platform, how cooperative they've been with law enforcement and what kind of different features they have, it varies really widely. Law enforcement have told me, you know, certain companies are really responsive and others aren't. Most will not respond to anyone besides law enforcement, but all social media websites have some kind of portal for law enforcement where they can subpoena or, you know, send information, ask for information. I have seen some increasing security features on dating websites where now there's more verification. So they might ask for the user to, you know, share a picture of them, like putting their hands like this or whatever to see if it matches. The problem is there's often, and those, that's great. And then they can get this check mark to verify them. But often they can change the image after and it'll still be verified, right? And so that's the problem, is that there are some steps and there's some ways around them, right? For our persistent stalkers, as unfortunately many of them are. So certainly every social media, you know, platform, if you go to, they'll have a user, they'll have terms of service for their users. They'll say certain things are not allowed. They'll have some place that users can report. And that's great. But in terms of the efficacy of that, and how responsive they are, that can just vary really, really widely. And I think one challenge is that a lot of responders who are looking at, for example, those portals, they're really thinking about urgent cases, and what they think is urgent is like there's about to be a shooting. They're not thinking about urgent in terms of a stalking course of conduct, which can last for years, but also increases the risk of violence and homicide and all these other things. And there's often a lack of urgency around stalking. Also, if you look at a lot of our workplace violence, a lot of it's related to stalking as well. So I guess I would argue stalking is urgent, but it needs an argument, right? Because I think that's not what most people are thinking of when they're thinking about, oh, do I as a platform need to urgently respond to something? In terms of non-consensual image distribution, you know, if an image or video is put on without consent on like a mainstream pornography website like Pornhub or something, usually you can have law enforcement put in a complaint under copyright and say they didn't have right to this. And usually that kind of website will take it down because they have so much content, they don't want to deal with it. Of course, once something's on the internet, it's hard to get it, you know, off the internet, right? And there certainly are websites that are dedicated to that kind of content, and so they're not going to be responsive. But you know, most, again, so kind of like, I don't know if I really answered your question. I'm like, sort of, you know, there's some things going on, but there's still a lot more that can be done. And yeah, it can be tricky and it's inconsistent. I'm just taking a look at the other questions. How can we help in areas with no context or training? Often there's no response. I'm not sure what you mean by no context or training. I think, do you mean where just you feel the response in your area to stalking isn't good and people don't know what to do? I mean, we're the national training provider, so people have to be willing to show up, obviously, but we're happy to train any potential or current grantee of the Office on Violence Against Women. So that includes law enforcement, victim service providers, campuses, really a range of folks. So they can certainly check out our resources or contact us for individualized training. And I think it depends what you mean by help, like help with what. So if you're looking at safety planning, we have some guidance around that on our website. There's certainly things, even if there is no law enforcement response or a victim doesn't want a law enforcement response, there's still ways to increase safety, right? To look at what are the risks? Is there anything that can help mitigate these? What is needed, and what can I do? So kind of breaking it down that way can be helpful. But so there's help without that. But yeah, I know it can be hard. And again, stalking is really under-resourced, and I feel you. So it can be really challenging. Someone just asked you the risk assessment. It's the one I mentioned earlier, SHARP, which is at coercivecontrol.org. You can also get to it from our website. If you go to stalkingawareness.org and under risk assessment, we'll send you there. So we didn't create it, but we love it. So we will happily send you that away. Yeah, any other questions? For stalking through social media, such as Facebook Messenger, what avenues can law enforcement use, or how can we guide a victim? So again, it kind of depends what it is. So Facebook's actually one of the better ones in terms of evidence, because you can get everything you've ever done on Facebook without telling anyone. That might be the scariest thing I've said all day, but you can see like the dumb thing you posted on Facebook 10 years ago. It doesn't go anywhere. And so you can go through your own settings and your history and filter it. So if, let's say, you're like, I got all these creepy Facebook messages 2 years ago from this person, you can go through your own settings and filter your messages by that time, and they will be there. You don't need the offender permission or anything. And so that's a really helpful one. You can pull that report. The victim can do that themselves. But if it's, say, Snapchat, which is notorious for getting rid of content as soon as it's viewed, that's the whole premise of Snapchat. And I've heard different things. I've heard, no, actually, this data exists for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, actually forever. Like, I've just heard inconsistent things. But the victim's going to have a hard time accessing that without law enforcement intervention, unless they took another picture right there. And so, with all of that, I think it depends on the platform and going through the history and what's saved and what's not. For Facebook messages that were deleted by the offender, I'm not totally sure. I think that's a good question. I think it would depend, like, what if they delete it within like the conversation or after or whatever. But if the victim received it, I don't think they can like unsend it, to my knowledge, but I could be wrong. But yeah, I know getting into these specifics, like, it's tricky and every platform's a little bit different. And so honestly, what I do, I mean, you're welcome to reach out. I'm happy to look at it with you, but I just kind of play with it and try it and say, does this work? Does that work? Because there's so many different uses of these or misuses of these. And yeah, there's always these nitty-gritty things. Let's see. What steps, or are there specific steps for law enforcement to take for hard to prove stalking? Like, say they don't have any evidence, basically. When there's no physical proof, what can we do? So one helpful thing, I mean, look, it's going to be hard to prosecute someone or to charge someone if you don't have any physical evidence of any kind. That's the reality of the situation. That being said, there's different ways to look for evidence. So one thing we often ask victims for is evidence of what they've changed as a result of the stalking behavior. Because I've had victims say, oh, I'm not afraid or anything, but I left their picture with front desk security, I changed my phone number, I blocked them on Instagram, and I got a new security system, and I call the daycare every day just to make sure no one else picks up my kids. Okay, so to me, that indicates a level of fear or emotional distress, right? Those aren't things you do when someone's kind of annoying you. And so, no, that may not prove that the person did it, but it proves the victim's fear and distress, which is also part of, that evidence and showing that this is having an impact on this victim, because stalking is about fear or distress. In terms of physical proof, I mean, I guess it would be looking at, and so often the first evidence is lost, right? Because they weren't expecting that text message, they deleted it, and now they're telling you, and it's really hard to get it now. But I think being predictive, thinking about, well, what access or information about this victim does the offender have? What behaviors might they engage in, and trying to be forward thinking and catching them next time, right? Well, I know that's not the greatest answer, because we want accountability now, not when they do it again, and I understand that. But if you're looking at evidence specifically, things like having game cameras, which, just take images or recordings when something moves outside, having, it doesn't have to be expensive or robust, but, in some way to capture that in the future, having witnesses, not being alone as much, so that there's always a witness. If it happens, they have someone else who can testify that it occurred. And of course, like you said, believing the victim, right? Even if they can't prove it, recognizing that offenders engage in these, what we call crazy making behaviors intentionally, like to make victims feel that no one will believe them, very much on purpose. Like one common stalker tactic is to break into a victim's vehicle or home and not take or break anything, but just leave some sign they were there. 1 in 5 victims report that they experienced that. And you can look at that, it's like, what's the point of that? It's just to be scary. It's just to have that victim call the police and say, I know they've been here because the lamp moved, and to sound nuts when in fact that's exactly what happened, right? And so, yeah, absolutely continue to believe victims, and just try to think ahead about evidence, witnesses, as well as capturing that evidence of their accommodations, I guess is what I would say. Okay, the rest of what I see are just compliments, which I will also accept, but I do not see any other questions. So I will uncharacteristically end early, which if you've been on my past webinars, I'm always like rushing at the end. So this is a big moment for me. But again, we are funded to provide training to most of the folks on the call. So if you're interested in further stalking training, or like everyone must hear this, let us know, reach out, and we're happy to work with you. And yes, this is being recorded. It will be on our archives on our website. So yeah, thanks so much and have a good weekend.